We have an important consumer alert tonight, and most people ignored it the first time they heard it. A major flour brand was recalled over contamination concerns, and for a few days it made headlines before disappearing from the news cycle. But here's the uncomfortable question nobody asked. If contamination can slip through once, what else is slipping through every single day without being recalled? Stop for a second and think about the bag of flour sitting in your pantry right now. It looks harmless, soft, clean, almost pure. But natural flour is never bright white like printer paper. Real flour has color, life, variation. If yours looks perfectly bleached and uniform, that didn't happen by accident. It was processed, stripped, treated, and standardized for shelf life and visual perfection, not for nutrition or digestibility. I spent weeks analyzing how the biggest flour brands operate, how they source wheat, how they process it, and what they add back in after removing everything natural from the grain. What I found wasn't just disappointing, it was revealing. In some countries, several of these practices are restricted or heavily regulated, but in American supermarkets, they're normal. Today, we're breaking down the brands you need to avoid immediately, and the ones professional bakers quietly trust instead. Stay until the end, because the difference between industrial flour and real flour is bigger than you think, and once you see it, you won't unsee it. Number 9. Gold Medal Flour. We have to start with the most recognizable name in the aisle, Gold Medal Flour. This brand dominates shelves across America, and because it feels traditional, most people never question it. But scale changes everything. When a company operates at massive industrial volume, the priority shifts from quality to consistency and cost control. Gold Medal sources wheat from enormous industrial farming networks, where crops are often treated with chemical desiccants before harvest to speed drying and increase efficiency. That means the wheat is harvested not at peak vitality, but at peak convenience. Once collected, it's blended from thousands of farms into massive silos to create uniformity. Uniformity sounds good, but it also means individuality, soil quality, and growing conditions are erased in the mixing process. Then comes aggressive roller milling at high speeds, generating heat that strips natural oils and flavor compounds from the grain. What remains is a pale, lifeless powder that must often be enriched artificially because the original nutrients were removed during refinement. The bright white color many consumers associate with clean flour is frequently achieved through bleaching agents like benzoyl peroxide or chlorine treatments, processes designed to accelerate aging and create visual consistency. The result is flour engineered for a long shelf life and predictable texture, not for digestive comfort or nutritional density. Many home bakers notice something they can't quite explain: dough that feels weak, flavor that feels flat, baked goods that brown unevenly or taste hollow. That isn't imagination. It's the difference between living grain and industrially neutralized powder. When flour becomes a 5-year shelf-stable commodity instead of a fresh agricultural product, something essential is lost. Gold Medal isn't dangerous because of one dramatic ingredient. It's concerning because of the entire system behind it. A system built for scale, speed, and margin, not for flavor depth or biological integrity. And when that becomes your everyday flour, repetition quietly amplifies everything the processing removed. Number 8. Great Value Flour. Now we move to Great Value Flour, the budget option that convinces shoppers flour is just flour and price is the only difference. That assumption is exactly what makes this brand so successful. Mauer. Great Value operates on extreme cost efficiency, which means sourcing the cheapest available commodity wheat at any given time. ACES. Unlike premium mills that can track specific wheat varieties for predictable protein structure, budget flour pulls from fluctuating supplies, meaning one batch may behave completely differently from the next. Protein content can vary noticeably between lots, and for baking, that inconsistency is everything. Gluten strength determines structure, elasticity, and rise, and when that foundation is unstable, your dough becomes unpredictable. Many home bakers notice sticky, grayish paste forming the moment water is added, dough that tears instead of stretches, bread that collapses instead of rising evenly. That isn't bad luck. It's inconsistency baked into the supply chain. Beyond performance, the deeper issue is refinement and enrichment. Commodity wheat is aggressively processed to extend shelf life and remove variability, stripping away bran, germ, and the natural oils that carry flavor and micronutrients. Once those elements are removed, synthetic vitamins are sprayed back onto the flour to meet enrichment standards. On paper, the nutrition label looks complete, but the biological complexity of the original grain is gone. Synthetic fortification cannot replicate the structure and synergy of intact nutrients within whole grain architecture. What remains is a standardized industrial input designed for cost control, not vitality. Shelf stability is prioritized above freshness, which means the flour is engineered to sit in distribution centers and warehouses for extended periods without noticeable degradation. That stability requires neutrality, and neutrality requires stripping away character. Even flavor suffers quietly, resulting in baked goods that taste flat, bland, or faintly chalky despite correct recipes. Consumers often blame themselves for failed results, assuming technique was the issue, when in reality, the flour never had the structural integrity to perform properly. Great value flour succeeds because it looks identical to higher-priced brands, but visually identical does not mean compositionally equal. When the foundation of your bread, pancakes, pizza, and pastries is built on fluctuating protein, stripped nutrients, and artificial enrichment, the result reflects that compromise. Cheap flour doesn't scream that it's inferior, it simply performs below its potential, and over time, that quiet compromise becomes your new normal in the kitchen. Number 7. Pillsbury Bleached All-Purpose Flour. Pillsbury flour feels nostalgic, familiar, almost wholesome, because of branding that has been embedded into American kitchens for generations. But branding is not the same as process, and once you look beyond the mascot and the polished packaging, the production story becomes far more industrial than comforting. Pillsbury's standard bleached all-purpose flour is engineered for visual perfection and rapid baking performance, not for preserving the integrity of the grain itself. Natural flour, when freshly milled, carries a slightly creamy tone and subtle aroma from its remaining oils. When flour is aggressively bleached to achieve a bright paper-white color, that isn't nature at work. Chemical bleaching agents accelerate aging and alter protein behavior to make dough feel softer and more pliable in a shorter time frame. The trade-off is depth, flavor, and often digestibility. Many home bakers notice baked goods that look perfect on the outside, yet taste oddly flat, chalky, or hollow underneath the sweetness of added sugar. That muted flavor isn't imagination. High-speed roller milling already strips bran and germ, removing natural fats that carry aroma and micronutrients. Bleaching then further standardizes what remains, creating a uniform powder that behaves predictably in large-scale commercial recipes. Predictable is profitable, but predictable also means stripped of character. Another overlooked issue is how heavily refined flour interacts with blood sugar. Without the fiber and natural structure of the whole grain, digestion accelerates rapidly, causing sharp glucose spikes followed by noticeable crashes. Energy rises quickly and then falls just as fast, leaving fatigue in its place. Consumers rarely associate that slump with flour, yet flour is the structural base of countless daily foods. Over time, reliance on highly refined, bleached flour trains the palate to prefer neutral texture over real wheat flavor, disconnecting people from what fresh grain actually tastes like. Pillsbury succeeds because it feels safe and traditional, but safety isn't determined by a logo. It's determined by sourcing, processing, and what gets removed long before the bag reaches your pantry. When a flour is optimized for shelf life and visual brightness rather than vitality and flavor depth, something essential is sacrificed, and most consumers never realize what they've been missing until they compare it to flour that hasn't been chemically accelerated into submission. Number 6. Generic self-rising store brand flour. Self-rising flour promises convenience, and convenience is powerful. The idea that leavening is already mixed in feels like a shortcut to perfect biscuits or quick breads. But that shortcut comes with trade-offs most consumers never consider. Generic self-rising store brands are typically built on the same highly refined, low-cost all-purpose base flour used in budget lines, then blended with chemical leavening agents and salt to create a one-bag solution. The problem begins with instability. Leavening agents such as baking powder are reactive by design, meaning they begin degrading the moment they're exposed to humidity, air, or time on a shelf. By the time the bag sits in a warehouse, then on a store shelf, then in your pantry, Part of that chemical activity has already weakened. That's why some biscuits rise unevenly, taste metallic, or leave a faint stinging sensation on the tongue. Lower-cost store brands often rely on aluminum-based leavening compounds because they're cheaper and more shelf-stable. But they can contribute to that sharp aftertaste many people can't quite identify. Beyond taste, there's the issue of control. When you bake with separate flour and fresh baking powder, you determine the ratio and freshness. With self-rising flour, you inherit whatever proportions were standardized months earlier in a factory. That removes flexibility and locks you into a formulation designed for mass predictability rather than quality nuance. The base flour itself is typically aggressively refined for maximum shelf life, stripped of bran and germ to prevent natural oils from going rancid. What remains is neutral starch structure that lacks depth and aroma. Salt levels are also predetermined, often higher than necessary, contributing to hidden sodium intake in foods that don't taste obviously salty. Over time, reliance on convenience blends shifts baking from a controlled craft to a passive habit, where chemical reactions replace ingredient awareness. Texture inconsistencies, off flavors, and dense crumb structures are frequently blamed on oven temperature or user error, when the real issue is aged chemical leaveners locked inside a processed flour blend. Self-rising flour isn't inherently catastrophic, but generic versions prioritize shelf stability and cost over freshness and flavor integrity. And when convenience replaces intentional ingredient control, number 5. Generic bread flour. Generic bread flour sounds like an upgrade. Higher protein, stronger dough, better structure for pizza and artisan loaves. That's the promise printed on the bag. But here's what most people don't realize. Not all high-protein flour is created equal. True bread flour comes from specific hard wheat varieties grown for strength and elasticity. Generic store-brand bread flour often achieves that high-protein label through blending shortcuts rather than superior grain quality. Instead of sourcing consistently strong wheat, manufacturers frequently take the same low-cost refined base flour and spike it with added vital wheat gluten or dough conditioners to artificially raise the protein percentage. On paper, the numbers look impressive. In practice, the structure feels forced rather than natural. When you mix water into quality bread flour, the dough becomes elastic, smooth, alive under your hands. With many generic versions, the dough feels tight, rubbery, almost resistant in an unnatural way. It stretches, but without silkiness. It snaps back aggressively instead of flowing. That's because the strength wasn't developed through grain integrity, it was engineered afterward. Another overlooked factor is how aggressively refined these flours are before enhancement. High-speed roller milling removes the bran and germ to maximize shelf life, eliminating natural oils and micronutrients that contribute flavor and digestibility. What remains is primarily starch and isolated protein, rebuilt into something that performs mechanically but lacks depth. Many home bakers notice crust that's chewy in a dense way rather than airy, crumb that feels heavy instead of open. And digestion often feels slower, heavier, as though the body has to work harder to break it down. Artificially boosted gluten concentration can create a tough bite when hydration and fermentation aren't perfectly balanced, and most casual bakers don't realize they're compensating for a manipulated product. Generic bread flour sells the idea of strength, but strength without balance creates imbalance. Real flour performance should come from the wheat itself, not from corrective additives layered on top of a weak foundation. When protein numbers become marketing tools rather than agricultural indicators, quality becomes harder to measure. And when consumers pay extra for bread flour expecting artisan results, only to receive industrial shortcuts, the difference shows up not just in texture, but in how the finished product feels hours after eating it. Number 4. King Arthur Baking Company flour. Now we shift from what to avoid to what serious bakers consistently choose, and King Arthur Baking Company stands at the top of that conversation. What separates this brand from mass-market flour isn't flashy marketing. It's structural discipline and sourcing transparency. King Arthur can track specific wheat varieties to maintain consistent protein levels from batch to batch, which means when the bag says a certain percentage, it's not an average guess, it's tightly controlled. That consistency matters because protein determines gluten formation, and gluten formation determines structure, elasticity, and rise. When flour behaves predictably, bakers can focus on fermentation, hydration, and technique instead of fighting unpredictable dough. Unlike many industrial brands, King Arthur does not rely on chemical bleaching to accelerate aging. The flour is unbleached, allowing natural maturation to occur without harsh treatments that alter aroma and flavor compounds. That alone preserves more of the wheat's inherent character. Milling is carefully calibrated to minimize excessive heat buildup, protecting the remaining nutrients and volatile oils that contribute subtle nutty notes and depth. When you open a bag, the aroma resembles grain, not neutrality. Dough made with it feels smooth, extensible, strong without being rubbery. Bread rises with structure yet maintains tenderness in the crumb. Beyond performance, there's the matter of corporate structure. As an employee-owned company, incentives differ from conglomerates focused solely on quarterly margins. Investment flows into quality control, education, and agricultural relationships rather than just distribution scale. This results in traceable sourcing and tighter batch oversight. Nutritional enrichment still occurs to meet standards, but because the base grain integrity remains intact, the final product retains more balance between starch, protein, and micronutrients. Consumers frequently report fewer digestive complaints when switching to unbleached, consistently milled flour, not because it's magical, but because it's less aggressively manipulated. King Arthur doesn't promise miracles, it delivers reliability. In baking, reliability is everything. When flour works with you instead of against you, recipes become repeatable, flavor deepens, and the kitchen feels less like an experiment and more like a craft. It may cost slightly more, but the difference shows up in structure, aroma, and overall eating experience. That's why many professionals quietly consider it the baseline standard in American supermarkets. Number 3. Bob's Red Mill Flour. Bob's Red Mill represents a different philosophy entirely, one rooted in traditional milling methods and transparency rather than aggressive industrial scaling. While most large flour producers rely on high-speed steel roller mills designed for maximum output, Bob's Red Mill is known for using stone milling for many of its products, a slower process that preserves more of the grain's natural structure. Stone milling generates less frictional heat compared to ultra-fast industrial rollers, which helps protect delicate oils and flavor compounds within the wheat germ. Those natural oils are often the first thing removed in large-scale processing because they shorten shelf life, but they are also where much of the grain's aroma and micronutrient density reside. When you open a bag of their stone-ground flour, the scent is noticeably fuller, nutty, earthy, distinctly grain-forward rather than neutral. That difference is not cosmetic, it reflects less aggressive refinement. Many of Bob's Red Mill offerings are organic, which reduces reliance on synthetic agricultural treatments and emphasizes crop rotation and soil stewardship. Organic certification does not guarantee perfection, but it does narrow exposure pathways often associated with commodity-scale wheat production. Texture also reveals the contrast. Dough formed with minimally processed flour feels supple yet natural, not artificially tightened or overly standardized. Whole wheat versions retain visible specks of bran, adding fiber structure that slows digestion and moderates glucose response compared to heavily refined white flour. That slower digestion curve often translates into steadier energy rather than sharp spikes and crashes. Flavor depth in finished baked goods becomes more pronounced, especially in simple recipes like pancakes or rustic bread, where flour is the star ingredient. Critics sometimes argue that stone-ground flour behaves differently and requires slight hydration adjustments, but that variation is the nature of real agricultural product rather than industrial powder engineered for uniform blandness. Bob's Red Mill embraces that identity, focusing on ingredient education and small-batch milling integrity. The result is flour that tastes connected to farmland rather than laboratory precision. It may cost a few dollars more per bag, but the sensory payoff, aroma, crumb texture, and digestive comfort often justify the investment. In a marketplace dominated by speed and uniformity, Bob's Red Mill remains a reminder that grain is an agricultural food first and a commodity second. Number 2. Central milling. When you step into serious artisan bakeries in cities known for bread culture, the flour stacked in the back rarely comes from mass supermarket brands. More often than not, it comes from mills like Central Milling, a company that operates closer to the agricultural source rather than the commodity silo. What makes central milling different is intentionality. Instead of blending anonymous wheat streams into uniform bulk powder, they work directly with farmers to cultivate specific wheat varieties selected for particular baking characteristics. That means protein levels are not just targets, they are outcomes shaped in the field long before milling begins. The grain itself is chosen for flavor, extensibility, and fermentation compatibility. Milling practices are calibrated to maintain functional integrity without overheating the grain, preserving structure rather than stripping it for neutrality. The result becomes obvious the moment water meets flour. Dough feels elastic yet fluid, capable of stretching thin without tearing, forming strong gluten networks that trap gas efficiently during fermentation. That elasticity isn't forced with additives. It comes from the grain's inherent strength. Flavor complexity also becomes more noticeable, especially in long-fermented breads, where subtle wheat sweetness and mineral notes emerge during baking. Central milling offers both conventional and organic lines, but even their standard offerings emphasize traceability and performance consistency that professional bakers rely on daily. This isn't flour engineered for a 5-year shelf presence, it's flour designed for fermentation-driven craft. Bakers using it often report deeper crust coloration, more open crumb structure, and improved oven spring without resorting to chemical dough conditioners. Digestively, many find that properly fermented dough made from carefully milled flour feels lighter, less dense, and more satisfying without heaviness. That difference comes not from marketing claims but from structural quality in the raw grain. Central milling may not dominate grocery shelves nationwide, but within professional circles, it carries credibility built on agricultural relationships and milling discipline. When flour becomes a precision tool rather than a generic ingredient, results shift dramatically. And once you experience dough that stretches effortlessly and bread that tastes layered instead of flat, it becomes difficult to return to commodity powder disguised as craftsmanship. Number 1. Janie's Mill. At the very top of this list sits Janie's Mill, not because it is the most widely available, but because it represents the closest connection between grain and kitchen you can realistically find in today's market. Janie's Mill is a small family-run operation focused on stone milling organic heirloom grains, varieties that have not been aggressively modified for industrial yield alone. Heirloom wheat behaves differently from modern commodity strains. It often carries deeper flavor, more nuanced sweetness, and mineral complexity that disappears in large-scale refinement. The milling process here is slow and temperature-controlled, preserving natural oils within the germ rather than stripping them out for extended shelf stability. Those oils are fragile, which is why industrial producers remove them, but they are also central to aroma, digestibility, and nutrient synergy. When you open a bag of Janie's Mill flour, the scent is layered, slightly sweet, distinctly grain-forward rather than neutral dust. Dough made from it feels alive in a way that surprises people used to mass-produced flour. It stretches with elasticity but without rubberiness, responds beautifully to long fermentation, and develops flavor that deepens rather than flattens during baking. The crumb of bread made from minimally processed flour often shows character, variation, subtle color differences that signal authenticity rather than bleaching uniformity. Because the grain is organically grown and carefully milled, exposure to heavy chemical treatment is reduced and structural integrity of the kernel is respected rather than pulverized for speed. Many bakers notice that meals made with less aggressively processed flour feel lighter and more satisfying, with fewer reports of post-meal heaviness or bloating. That difference is not magic. It is the result of grain that has not been stripped, bleached, and rebuilt for mass distribution. Janie's Mill flour may require mindful storage because of retained natural oils, but that very freshness is evidence of vitality rather than shelf engineering. It costs more, it may require online ordering in some regions, and it asks the baker to engage with real agricultural variability. But what it offers in return is flavor depth, structural integrity, and a reconnection to what flour tasted like before industrial acceleration became the norm. In a world of standardized powder, Janie's Mill stands as proof that flour can still be food rather than formula. Conclusion. So now you have a clear divide in front of you. On one side, bleached, aggressively refined, shelf-engineered flour designed for uniformity, speed, and corporate efficiency. On the other, Carefully sourced, thoughtfully milled grain that behaves like food instead of industrial input. The difference isn't just price, it's structure, aroma, digestibility, and long-term experience. Most people never question flour because it looks simple. White powder in a bag feels neutral, harmless, interchangeable. But as you've seen, processing choices made long before that bag reaches your pantry determine whether your bread tastes flat or alive, whether your dough fights you or flows with you, whether your body feels heavy afterward or energized. The modern food system trains consumers to prioritize convenience and cost over integrity, and over time, that standard becomes invisible. Bleaching becomes normal. Artificial enrichment becomes normal. Commodity blending becomes normal. Until you compare it side by side with flour that hasn't been stripped and rebuilt for margin. The brands at the bottom of this list aren't evil. They're engineered for scale, but scale always demands compromise. The brands at the top aren't magical. They simply protect more of what the grain naturally offers. And that preservation changes everything from crust color to crumb texture to how satisfied you feel after eating. Flour is the foundation of bread, pizza, pancakes, pastries, and countless daily staples. When the foundation improves, everything built on top improves with it. So the choice is simple. Continue buying what's cheapest and most familiar because it feels safe, or upgrade the base ingredient that shapes so many meals each week. Sometimes the most powerful change in your kitchen isn't a new recipe. It's replacing the bag of flour you've trusted for years without ever questioning